Before Michael continues, at the end of his talk, if he's still got a voice, he'll perhaps be able to take a few questions. But before we do that, just in case I forget at the end, I'd like to thank him for being here today and agreeing to give not just one but two lectures on such interesting topics. I'm anticipating that the next one will be as interesting as the previous one was. It's a small gift. It's a book I wrote, so you know. And we'll post it to his home address so he doesn't have to carry it all the way to Egypt.
Yes, I'm going to Egypt from Perth.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Enjoy.
I'll give you this.
Thanks. You can hear me, I hope. No. I think the lights went up. All right. In this lecture, I'm going to talk about the Library of Alexandria. I wanted to just give an overview about what we know about the Library of Alexandria, and at the end, obviously, we'll talk about the loss of the library as well, and when that might have occurred. So the Library of Alexandria, of course, part of a famous complex of buildings which made up the Mouseion in Alexandria. Alexandria, a coastal city of Egypt, not actually connected to the Nile directly, but on the Mediterranean coast, founded by Alexander the Great during his conquest of the Persian Empire, a city named after him. It became one of the great centers of Hellenistic culture, the culture that developed in the whole of the Near East following the death of Alexander the Great. For 300 years, Hellenized, Greek-speaking kingdoms developed in the whole of the Middle East, and the general Ptolemy took Egypt and ruled it, founding a dynasty that would last until Cleopatra the seventh. Alexandria, famous for its civic structures. Today, a lot of archaeology going on, particularly in the harbour area, because in late antiquity, a series of earthquakes caused the whole of North Africa to suddenly drop some meters. The most important earthquake was in AD 365, and much of the royal palaces of the Ptolemies is currently under this harbour where I'm actually standing when I took this photo. So ongoing underwater archaeology is revealing a lot about the harbour areas, certainly of the Ptolemaic period. The Ptolemies were Greek-speaking Macedonians from northern Greece. They brought with them their Greek culture, Greek religion, and included in that culture, of course, was the writing of Homer from a much earlier age, the 8th century, first written down in the 5th century. They came as an invading colonizer of Egypt, and as we'll see, the early Ptolemies decided to establish an institution which would place them amongst the highest ranks of their fellows in the Middle East, the Mouseion. The Mouseion was a scholarly institution where the crown provided funds for the sustenance of intellectuals. Probably in the order of 200 to 300 scholars were kept by crown expense, and their sole task was to have free thought, to investigate the natural world, and to aid them, as we'll see, the early Ptolemies, particularly Ptolemy I and Ptolemy II, established a library where the knowledge of humanity could be kept, consulted, and used. This is something of a romantic reconstruction of what the Library of Alexandria probably looked like, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why this reconstruction might be correct. The foundations of the Library of Alexandria go back to the reign of Ptolemy I, one of the generals of Alexander the Great, who followed him on his campaigns all the way to the Indus, came back to Babylon, and took control of Egypt, taking possession of that very rich country and making it his kingdom. Ptolemy had been brought up at the court of Alexander the Great. He was a close companion of Alexander the Great, knew him very well. And when he came to Egypt, eventually bringing the body of Alexander the Great to Alexandria to be buried in the center of the city in the Sema, Ptolemy I had in his possession Alexander the Great's diary. Wouldn't that be nice to have Alexander the Great's diary still surviving? Not only that, he had the writings of other historians who had traveled with Alexander to the Indus. So he had in his possession knowledge that we don't possess today, and he expressed the interest in writing a history of Alexander the Great, because he was a personal companion, had been brought up at court, being taught by Aristotle with Alexander the Great. So he had a great deal of knowledge of his friend and companion, Alexander, but also he had the intellectual heritage of Aristotle, the great intellectual of the 4th century BC. A few sculptural representations are preserved of Ptolemy I. He's a ruthless character who eradicated all opposition, but during his reign, end of the 4th century BC and beginning of the 3rd century, he established an institution which would try to rival the great academic institutions that existed in Greece. And the main institution that he wanted to imitate was the Lyceum, basically a university that had been established by Aristotle in the aftermath of Alexander the Great's death. So the Lyceum became the model for, and he would actually draw on the institution of the Lyceum to staff his new institution, the Mouseion, the Institute of the Muses, and the library that he had in mind to create was also clearly modeled on the library of the Lyceum. So he knew Aristotle, who appears in this Renaissance fresco on the right there. He knew Aristotle, he knew him personally, he was his tutor back up in Pella. And he was particularly interested in the scholarship of Aristotle and to equal and better the institution of the Lyceum in Athens, which was then the leading cultural institution in Athens. He tried very hard to get Theophrastus, the head of the Lyceum, to come to Alexandria to teach and to write and to recreate the Lyceum in Alexandria. Theophrastus was, and still is, famous for the work that he had done on the description of botany. He's often considered the father of botany. because he was the first ancient scholar to systematically try to describe how plants should be broken up into different categories and how to describe them. And Theophrastus, a student and friend of Aristotle, was drawing on Aristotelian principles about how you divide up the world, how you study the world, and how you write and study it in particular. Theophrastus had inherited Aristotle's library and lecture notes. So amazing to think, wouldn't it be incredible to have Aristotle's lecture notes in your possession? Ptolemy I, having established his kingdom, was hoping all of that would come to him, that he could draw really the scholarship of the Lyceum and all that library to Alexandria. Theophrastus, however, didn't like the idea. He was quite happy to stay in Athens and to continue to teach. But Theophrastus did send one of his students, Strato, or Straton. He appears in this fresco in Athens. Strato is often described as the first scientist. He also, like Theophrastus and Aristotle, had been brought up with the idea that the world could be categorized, studied, experimented upon. But Strato is really the first of these philosopher inquirers who stated explicitly, we need to let go of religion. The gods have no part to play in the natural world, and everything we see can be experienced, can be explained as the event of natural processes. So in the history of science, Strato stands out as really the first of these Hellenistic scholars to say, let's move on from religion and work towards a systematic description of the natural world. Strato agreed and went to Alexandria and really established the Mouseion, the teaching institution there. So the origins of the library and the whole teaching institution of the Mouseion really go back to Strato. This is a medieval woodcut, sort of a romantic notion of what he would have looked like. So in addition to Strato coming to establish the Mouseion, Ptolemy I turned to another individual, Demetrius of Phaleron. Demetrius had ruled Athens for a decade, had been also a pupil of Theophrastus and of Aristotle, very clever individual interested in the natural world. Ptolemy I invited Demetrius to come and really establish the library. And Demetrius was an excellent choice to do that. So this is all happening around 300 BC, that the library is being established in Alexandria. Demetrius convinced Ptolemy I that it was worth creating a library where the new teaching institution could consult. The king already had an extensive library in his possession, and Demetrius clearly had a close intellectual relationship with Ptolemy I. One of the things that Demetrius brought with him was an understanding that the Ptolemies and the other Hellenistic kings of the Near East had inherited a rich and diverse and different cultures of the Near East. And the world wasn't just Greek culture. And Ptolemy I was influenced by Demetrius in his writing of a biography of Alexander, you must not just talk about what Alexander did, but the people that he encountered, the animals and the plants that he encountered on his way. And this got Ptolemy I interested in the collection of ethnographic information. What do we know about the people of India? What do we know about the Jews? What do we know about the people who lived in Mesopotamia, the Babylonians? So Demetrius really inspired Ptolemy I to broaden his horizons and look at the diverse cultures that had become incorporated into the Hellenistic kingdom of Egypt. And it was really Demetrius who was a driving force for the Mouseion, the Institute of the Muses. So the Muses here represented in a very sort of romantic form. Almost immediately, Ptolemy I began the collection of manuscripts for a library, and the process was a slow and steady one. The library that he really wanted was the library of the Lyceum. Ptolemy offered to buy the library of the Lyceum. Unfortunately, they refused. They just said, sorry, no. But Ptolemy also suggested, I'll buy manuscripts from people. So he was interested in particularly the manuscripts of the great playwrights which existed and were stored in the Lyceum. And he offered, I will pay for those manuscripts to be brought to Egypt. I will make a copy and give the original back to you. The people in the Lyceum knocked back all offers because they knew once the manuscripts were out of their hands, it was highly likely that Ptolemy would not return them. So he had to come by other means to add to the library. The library, I think I've given you this map on the front page. The library certainly was in the Mouseion, which was the royal quarter of Alexandria. It lay not so far from the crossroads. The Soma there was the tomb of Alexander the Great. Certainly from subsequent events, we know that the library was within the palace grounds and was close to the water, close to the harbour. Its exact location has not been pinpointed. It's because Alexandria is densely populated today, and you can only excavate when a building is knocked down. You have a quick opportunity to excavate, perhaps. So at the moment, we haven't got the exact location of the ancient library and the Mouseion, but we do have now the ability to excavate in the port area there and here. This is all being excavated through underwater archaeology. And the Mouseion, the Institute of the Muses, from which we get the word museum, of course. Can we say anything about the structure of the Ptolemaic library? We can. There are a number of important inscriptions, ancient texts, that talk about the library and talk about its physical characteristics. One of the most important documents describing ancient Alexandria is Strabo's geography. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's a detailed description of the entire Mediterranean world. Strabo visited many of the regions, and clearly his descriptions of the places that he talks about are from personal experience. Yeah, I saw this, and and then I went up that hill and I saw that. So Strabo's description of Alexandria is long, and it's very useful for putting things in context, the location of things and what they were like. he was a contemporary of Augustus, so he's writing at the end of the 1st century BC, beginning of the 1st century AD. What he tells us about the library is certainly there was a colonnaded court as part of the complex, a peripatos, and then there were library facilities, the main library building. There were lecture halls, and the facilities for the academics were nearby. To be employed by the Ptolemies as an academic was seen as something remarkable for the ancient world. The kings paid you money to think. That was somewhat unusual in the ancient world. They gave you board and lodging and a salary, and you could, as long as you wrote, I'm sure David has had this experience, as long as you wrote something, they continued to pay you, which was nice. So it was a cushy job that many people wanted, and many scholars and academics from all over the Greek-speaking world were drawn to the Mouseion. The Ptolemies were fabulously wealthy. They controlled one of the wealthiest regions of the ancient world. They had the money and the desire to inspire and influence scholarship, and to get tenure at the Mouseion was a great prize. And we know that it was a great prize because quite a few scholars who didn't get tenure belittle it fiercely and say, it was, who'd want to go to the Mouseion anyway. What the library looked like, how it functioned internally, we can only really make suggestions based on other surviving libraries from the ancient world. Probably one of the best known libraries from the Roman world is the Library of Celsus at Ephesus, which you might have seen. And we know that this single room contained probably in the order of 6,000 papyri. They were arranged in shelves around the walls. There was a mezzanine, a flight of stairs to a mezzanine and more shelves. So within that kind of area that you see there, 6,000 scrolls could be kept and made available. The books of the ancient world, the books of this period, were written on papyrus. Papyrus is made by overlapping verticals and horizontals and beating the two together until you get the natural juices of the papyrus bonding the two layers together. Normally you can only produce a sheet of this size, and traditionally in the Hellenistic Greek world, a papyrus book would normally be 11 meters long. So if you were reading Livy or Polybius, Polybius or Livy would be writing, each chapter would be one scroll, a book, up to 10 or 11 meters long. Traditionally in the Egyptian world, you of course read the papyrus that way. But in the Greco-Roman world, you read the papyrus that way, because you read from left to right. So you have to imagine with these papyri, imagine you remember that the author said something really interesting about Alexander the Great, or any subject, or Julius Caesar. How are you going to find that quote? Really tricky, because you've got to unfurl this papyrus, or usually you held the papyrus and rotated the upright wooden shafts, and you had to go through until you found the quote. It was quite difficult to actually find a quote. And that's why most ancient scholars who are writing, who quote from memory, and they usually get it wrong. because it's too much bother to open the chapter and find the specific inscription that you're looking for and to copy it out. If people like Pliny, who are quoting other authors, they do so from memory, much easier. And when we actually have the surviving text, we can compare it and say it's really the same. With the papyrus, you wrote on the verso side of the papyrus. The verso side is the horizontal side. So you would normally write a page. So that's what a papyrus scroll from these times would have looked like. It would have been, you would have opened it and read it. And you would write your text in columns or pages down the papyrus scroll. So you could decide the width of your page. It didn't have to equal the width of the papyrus panel. The papyrus panels were hammered together. So you would have maybe 30 or 40 papyrus panels in one scroll. The writing was on the horizontal side of the papyrus. The other side, the verso of a papyrus, usually was blank, and that's where the vertical stripes of the papyrus are. And the reason for that is the verticals can't be pushed backwards beyond flat, because the verticals crush against each other and break. So the vertical panels of the papyrus must only be folded inwards. Okay, so you're only reading a papyrus generally from one side, the verso side, the recto side, sorry, and the verso or vertical panels strips would be on the other side. So this is an example of a Greek papyrus of this type. What we call, or what they used to call a book, they meant a scroll, and that's really the equivalent of our chapter. Now, a number of ancient sources talk about the library in this period, most from a much later period, and they vary in the description of the number of books in the library. The majority, however, indicate that there were at least 400,000 scrolls in the library, which is the equivalent of 400,000 chapters of books. That's probably how we should understand it. Some of the scrolls would have contained multiple pieces of writing. If you have a scroll and you're starting blank, you could write a number of texts on that scroll. So some of the texts, some of the individual scrolls would have had multiple smaller texts on them. A few ancient sources talk about 700,000 scrolls, and that's the highest kind of quote, but they're usually late sources, and it is possible that by late Ptolemaic times there were 700,000 scrolls in the library. Traditionally, Ptolemy I is associated with translation of non-Greek texts into Greek. And the most world-shattering and influential of these translations was the translation of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, into Greek. And that's the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Old Testament. That took place during the lifetime of Ptolemy I. People like Demetrius of Phaleron convinced Ptolemy, because of the number of Jews that lived in Alexandria, and they were an influential part of his economy and his society, that their book, the Old Testament was worthy of being translated and incorporated into the library. And Jewish scholars were brought from throughout the Jewish diaspora to translate the Pentateuch into Greek. And because they did so, they had a huge influence on the history of Christianity that was to come, because if there had been no Greek translation of the Old Testament, the transmission of the ideas of the Old Testament into the classical world would have been far less possible. So Ptolemy's translation of the Old Testament certainly facilitated the spread of Christianity at a later period. This is a kind of romantic representation of Ptolemy talking to the Jewish scholars who spoke Greek, of course, establishing the translation of the Septuagint. We have many surviving examples of books that once were in the Library of Alexandria. We should keep in mind that only probably, if we're looking at, say, by this period, 400,000 texts, probably it's estimated only 1% survives today of what was in the library. And we know the details of many books that were eventually to be put in the library. We know the names of the books and we know what they were about, but those manuscripts don't survive down to the present day. Some of them were remarkable texts, like Aristarchus's theory that the earth went round the sun. And we tend to think that's medieval Renaissance understanding of the universe, but it's not. It was an ancient idea. Many of those ancient writings we know only by brief quotes, probably inaccurate, in later writings. Some of the original, very early Greek translations of the Septuagint survive. This is a medieval Greek translation of the Septuagint. Ptolemy I and subsequent Ptolemies, particularly Ptolemy II and III, the scholars that were working at the library were particularly interested in the study of the manuscripts that they had in their possession. They were collecting manuscripts wherever they could. And Ptolemy III famously used to get customs officials to enter any ship coming into Alexandria port and search for books. And if he found a book, he would take it, make a copy, and give back the copy to the boat owner. And you could be penalized if you hid a book and didn't allow it to be copied. So we know that in this period there were multiple manuscripts of Homer, of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Thankfully, at some sites in Egypt, like Oxyrhynchus, actual papyrus copies of Homer survive in little fragments like this. But we know that at the library there were multiple manuscripts of Homer. And it was in this period that Homer was being studied in great detail and divided up into 24 chapters. So our breaking up of the texts of the Iliad, for instance, stems from Alexandrian scholarship. And what the Alexandrian scholarships were interested in were the linguistic variations in the text, why there were different versions of the text, because for centuries Homer had been an oral text, transmitted orally, and really was only being written down for the first time in the 5th century BC. By the time we come down to the 3rd century, there were multiple versions of the Iliad. Which is the right one? So the scholars were interested in trying to piece together what was the most likely manuscript from Homer's original text. We should keep in mind that our earliest surviving manuscript of the Iliad dates to the 10th century AD. There were 1,500 years of the manuscript, but none of those early volumes survive. It would be nice, wouldn't it, to find a hidden cache of documents which contained an early version of the Iliad, to be able to compare it to the version from Alexandria. You might have heard of the Villa of the Papyri in Herculaneum. Have you been reading about that? It's been in the media recently. A philosophical library was discovered in the Villa of the Papyri in Herculaneum. And the papyri have been preserved in the volcanic mud that flowed into the house. And they're being scanned, and it's being possible to read the papyri without unrolling them. Quite incredible. They're using CT scanning and other methods, infrared scanning, and they're discovering ancient texts that no longer survive. So quite amazing that that's been possible. Wouldn't it be nice if they found significant missing texts from early scholarship? Most of the documents were Roman era philosophical texts. The library really came into its own in the time of Ptolemy II. We're talking the early 3rd century BC. By that point, the library was well established, and the manuscripts were being studied. The shift from Ptolemy I to Ptolemy II was somewhat traumatic. Many scholars lost their job at the death of Ptolemy I because they backed the wrong prince to become the heir to the throne. Poor old Demetrius of Phaleron ended up being put in prison, lost his job when Ptolemy II came to power. Ptolemy II and his sister wife Arsinoe caused a great scandal by marrying in the Egyptian style. Many scholars made fun of it and lost their jobs at the Mouseion as a result. You had to be very careful about what you said about the kings. But certainly by the time of Ptolemy II, the library was, as I said, well established. It's in this period that scholars are coming in from all over the classical world, and a number of scholars are coming in from the old Ptolemaic, the edges of the Ptolemaic kingdom, in places like Cyrene in Libya, which had an intellectual tradition. The most important of these scholars are writing in a new style. There's some examples. They're writing a much more romantic, non-critical style. And increasingly in Alexandria, the scholarship of the Mouseion is turning more and more to literary analysis, not original work, but study of other people's works. It becomes increasingly common in this period. Timon was very critical of the scholars in the Mouseion at this time, and he's the one that he refers to the hens in the hen house just clucking away. Their scholarship is of little value. One of the most important librarians of the Library of Alexandria from the time of Ptolemy II is Apollonius of Rhodes. And he wrote a new work, which makes him stand out in scholarship, the Argonautica, the story of Jason and the Argonauts. So this was a new mythic poem written in the style of Homer, but completely new. So there was literary works being created in addition to literary criticism. This is an early manuscript of the Argonautica. It's very sort of... the Argonautica is typical of its age in that the gods recede into the background and play virtually no part. It's the hero, Jason, and the events that he is involved with are all important. So Homer had seen the gods very much active participants in the story, whereas in the Argonautica, the gods are disappearing, really, in this kind of world. The Ptolemies had a monopoly on the creation of papyrus. They ruled Egypt, where papyrus grew naturally, and papyrus production was a royal monopoly controlled by the crown, extremely valuable commodity to be traded throughout the Mediterranean world. It was the only source of papyrus. Increasingly, there was competition between the Ptolemaic royal house and other successor kingdoms, the Hellenistic kingdoms in Greece and in Turkey and in Syria. The main rival for intellectual center to Alexandria was Pergamum in Western Turkey. Their successor state had developed at Pergamum with a line of kings like the Ptolemies, spending lots of money on intellectual investigation, on scholarship, and creating a library. And I've been to Pergamum with tour groups many times. The library survives, the library of Pergamum on the Acropolis. And you can actually see where the bookcases were arranged in some of the rooms. It is said, according to ancient sources, that the library of Pergamum had 200,000 scrolls. And the Ptolemies, particularly Ptolemy II, was particularly annoyed that the kings of Pergamum were setting themselves up as intellectual rivals to the teaching institution of Alexandria, and they forbade the export of papyrus to Pergamum. It was to be made illegal. The kings of Pergamum suddenly had no paper on which to write. The scholarship of Pergamum suddenly hit a brick wall, and a new writing medium was created as a result of that. It was animal skin, mainly kid skin, and it was called pergamene material, from which we get the word parchment. Comes from Pergamum. It was pergamena, parchment. Parchment is animal skin, treated, and parchment had one early advantage over papyrus in that it's much easier to sew it together in leaves and create a book, a codex. Therefore, without Ptolemy II's embargo on the export of papyrus, books may not have been invented so early, but the kings of Pergamum in the 2nd, 3rd century BC are creating the first books. They would have looked like this: parchment leaves sewn together. And it's much easier to use a parchment codex than a papyrus scroll, because you can find a quote much more quickly and easily. And so books gradually would replace scrolls as we progress, particularly down into medieval times when papyrus goes out of use altogether to be replaced by parchment. Ptolemy III, perhaps the most vigorous proponent of building up the library, of boycotting export of papyrus, and also taking possession of manuscripts and entering ships in Alexandria harbour. Certainly the libraries of Athens still refused to give up the great library of the Lyceum in the outskirts of Athens. And they refused to part with the books, knowing that they'd never see them again. This is a romantic rendering of what the library must have looked like. The library still existed into late Ptolemaic times, but had lost certainly the Mouseion had lost some of its luster by the time of Ptolemy XII, Auletes. His daughter, Cleopatra VII, inherited the throne. During the Roman civil wars, when Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt pursuing Pompey the Great, he took possession of the palace area of Alexandria with his troops down by the harbour edge there. And of course we have the famous scene of Cleopatra being unfurled in a carpet to try to get access to him. During the battle for Alexandria, a major fire was started in the harbour area, which got out of control, and many ancient sources refer to the fact that the library burnt down during Julius Caesar's taking possession of Alexandria at this point in 44 BC. That must be 48, sorry. The evidence seems to be quite clear. It talks about the burning of the warehouses of the books near the harbour, a great loss. These kind of sources like Plutarch refer to this as taking place. Subsequent events that would take place in the reign of Cleopatra VII would indicate that there is some truth to this. And it seems highly likely that the library did significantly get destroyed at this period when Caesar was in Alexandria. The reason why we know about that is that, or why we have evidence that supports that notion, is that when Mark Antony came to power and was living with Cleopatra, he took possession of the library of Pergamum and took a long-term loan. He took the library and gave it to Cleopatra to replace the library that had previously been lost. So poor old Pergamum lost its major collection. That certainly implies that there was significant destruction done during the siege of Alexandria. Cleopatra, of course, committed suicide, and Egypt comes under the possession of the Roman world under Augustus and his heirs. The library that Mark Antony had taken from Pergamum and deposited in Alexandria continued to function for some centuries, and there were notable scholars working in the Mouseion right through the 1st and 2nd century AD, certainly. The most famous of them being Claudius Ptolemy, who wrote about the heavens and a geography. The in later Roman periods, there are a number of references to the library and periods of civil disturbance in which much damage was done to the palace grounds. This is happening in the 3rd century AD. There was riots that destroyed the palace. Traditionally, the last remnants of the Library of Alexandria are said to be collections of books that were kept at the Temple of Serapis in the south west part of the settlement. This is often described as a daughter library of the main library. And we know that there were manuscripts kept at the Serapeum. During events of the period around 409, that library was destroyed. I don't know if you've seen the movie Agora, which is well worth seeing. It represents the destruction of the Serapean library, and that traditionally sees the destruction of the last collection of books in Alexandria. A mob of Christian fanatics burns down the Temple of Serapis in 409 and murders Hypatia, the last of the Neoplatonic philosopher teachers of Alexandria, who was stripped and died a fairly nasty death. She was scraped to death with shells. That's the last that we really hear of the Library of Alexandria or its descendants. There was an apocryphal, much, much later 14th century tradition, which is dubious, that the Arab invader of Egypt, Amr ibn al-As, came to Alexandria and was asked what to do with the books from the library. And he, traditionally, according to this text, his answer was, if it conforms with the Quran, we don't need it, and if it is antithetical to the Quran, we should burn it. And the last of the books we used to heat the water in the baths, so his army could have a hot bath. But that story seems unlikely. It's much more likely that the library, the last remnants of the Library of Alexandria, were destroyed with the Christian sack of the Temple of Serapis in the early 5th century. I must admit it would be nice to find a hidden cache of documents from the Library of Alexandria, and I place myself amongst the geeks who still get upset. We should take the opportunity to reflect on the fact that we think that knowledge will never disappear, but it will. And one day the internet will be turned off, and that will be the end of us all. We should keep books for the future. Thanks very much.